And in these circumstances, it becomes quite difficult for anyone to say with any predictability what rules apply, other than apparently for the moment that might is right. Now, that's not quite the way the world was supposed to work, but certainly a lot of what Mr. Trump has done in his 11 months in office are not the ways in which anyone has ever seen an American president at work. So we just seem to need to adjust ourselves to a new reality in the White House.
Is that what you believe is Trump's justification? Might is right. I'm powerful. I'm the most important politician in the world. I will get my way.
I think it's an unspoken justification, but it's the only way we can describe the sum total of all his statements, posturing, and indeed actions in the last 11 months.
So might is right is Trump's justification.
Trump's justification, again, he's never sought to justify himself. If he feels mighty enough, he doesn't feel he needs to justify himself.
Precisely, yes. When might is right, you don't need to justify it. But that is the explanation. Might is right.
I would say that's pretty much what we're seeing out of Washington for now. Absolutely.
Hi, I'm Karan Thapar. Over the last few years, I hope you've been watching my program, The Interview on the Wire. During that period, I've interviewed doctors, politicians, businessmen, scientists, authors, and even the occasional Nobel laureate. For me, it's been exciting. I hope it's been enjoyable for you. But these, as you know, are tough times, and if this program is going to remain bold, independent, and sometimes even defiant, then I think we need your support. At the end of the day, it's a truism, but editorial independence is best defended by the viewers. So if you would like this program to remain the way it is, forthright, outspoken, and interesting, then would you consider supporting us? All you have to do is to click on the description at the bottom. But more than anything else, I hope you will continue to watch the interview. Your viewership means an awful lot to me.
Hello and welcome to a special interview for The Wire. Is President Trump backing off military action in Tehran, or is he misleading Iranians to retain the element of surprise? Second, is President Trump determined to take Greenland even at the cost of shattering NATO and the Atlantic alliance between Europe and America? Third, is President Trump's action in Venezuela a form of modern-day colonialism? And finally, if Trump claims the Western Hemisphere America, is he willing to concede similar spheres of interest to Russia and China? And what implications would that have for us in India? Those are some of the key issues I shall raise today with the former Minister of State for External Affairs, Shashi Tharoor. Shashi Tharoor, after threatening very strong action if Iran executes protesters, Trump has now said that Iran has no plans to do so. So let me start by asking, is he backing off military action? Is he deliberately misleading the Iranians to retain the element of surprise? Or do you expect military action will still happen? What's your hunch?
No, I think he is backing off the military action. And what's more, I think that it may not have been entirely a White House decision, in the sense that I suspect that the Gulf countries and the other US allies in the region were beginning to get quite alarmed about the direction in which things were going in Iran. Now, latest reports, though we can't really tell since the internet is down in Iran, suggest that not only have some 800-odd executions been stayed, but that the protests themselves might be subsiding. And if that is the case, that may be the result of a certain sense of alarm, or at least of disquiet, on the part of Saudi Arabia, a number of the other neighboring countries, about two obvious consequences of the way things seemed to be spiraling spiraling downhill. One would have been a chaotic, messy breakdown of authority in Iran, which could have resulted in the destabilization of the region, the flows of large numbers of refugees into neighboring countries, including the relatively narrow waters of the Straits and the Gulf. And you might suddenly have found a number of countries themselves worrying about the example this would set for restive populations in their own countries. And suddenly there was a sense of alarm about how far things have been allowed to go with Iran. The second thing, I think, was the increasing awareness that the collapse of this regime in Iran would essentially reinforce the increasing dominance, if not even primacy, of Israel across that part of West Asia. And that is something which some of the Arab countries, for all their dislike of Iran, and I think it's fair to point out that the Saudis and others have no great love lost for Iran, and they see as a strategic rival, and whose Shia majority is not seen with the same favor in many of the Sunni majority countries. So given all of that, it's not that there's a great deal of love lost for Iran, but there certainly is no desire to see Zionist Israel as the dominant force in West Asia. So I would say these two considerations have obviously encouraged a number of countries to put pressure on the US, saying, have you thought through what you're doing here? You're inciting trouble. If you're going to then go into strikes, especially with Israeli collaboration, we are not on board. And I understand that there were even signals to Iran from some of the Arab countries that they would not allow their territory to be used as basis for airstrikes by either America or Israel. And all of that, I think, would have played into the final decision, which I think is now pretty much clear, will be to back off from the...
Well, hang on a second. You say it's pretty much clear. You believe that the Americans are backing off, but Trump's UN ambassador categorically said yesterday in the UN that, in fact, all options are still on the table. And when asked, Trump himself has said he still retains the right to act depending upon what happens. So let me put this to you. If Iran is attacked, Iran has made it clear that it will retaliate very strongly. It says it will hit American bases in the region, it will hit American shipping, it could even block the Strait of Hormuz. So if Trump does attack and Iran retaliates, are we then inevitably heading into a full-scale war?
Okay, on both your points. On the first one, I think it's obvious that to say one would retain all one's options remains necessary. Otherwise, all the last few days of posturing and bellicose statements would look like so much hot air. So it's extremely important to convey we're still serious if you guys want us not to do this and continue to behave. But the corollary is, if you behave, we won't do it. And that is ultimately, I think, where the Americans have come up. The Iranians have stayed executions, protests are subsiding. Even 3 or 4 more days maximum, all the protesters are back at home. Some who have been sentenced to death are either jailed or even released. I think the story of this particular street agitation will pretty much have subsided.
But can I point out
the larger question? You asked 2 questions. Let me answer the second one now. That's on the first one. On the second one, I would certainly agree that had there been an attack, all of those consequences could have followed. We don't, of course, know what kind of attack there would have been, how they would have been conducted, planes, missiles, even intercontinental missiles. Who knows how serious they were about all of this, especially if they did not have local bases from which to operate. We don't know what kind of devastating attacks could have taken place. If Iran had then retaliated, let me be making it very clear to you that American bases are in Arab countries. These are not bases in America that Iran's talking about. They would be retaliating against a number of neighboring Arab countries in which American bases are. And those Arab countries certainly don't want Iranian missiles raining down upon them. Even if some miss American bases, they'll be killing Arabs. So there is a very, very serious concern there. And I'm sure all of that played into the messaging from the Arab countries to Washington not to proceed.
But there's an essential contradiction in what Trump has said. Now he's saying he's prepared not to attack because Iran has assured him that there will be no executions. But earlier, Trump's position was not about executions. He said he would attack if the protesters were killed. By some counts, over 2,500 protesters have been killed, but Trump hasn't attacked. So Trump is essentially changing the lines of his own position.
Well, I don't think that particularly should come as a surprise to you, Karan. We've seen...
But is he chickening out?
Goalposts.
But is he chickening out?
I beg your pardon?
Is he chickening out?
Well, that's what his critics in America like to say, the famous taco phrase. But I think Trump would probably have a more dignified explanation that his threats and his bluster worked in terms of dialing down the Iranian repression, and that he took the broader view as a statesman-like president is what he probably would want us to think.
Tell me, to what extent has he also been concerned by the fact that if he were to attack, there would have been a rally around the Iranian flag? That's what happened in June when America bombed Iranian nuclear sites. If that had happened again, it would have benefited the Ayatollah regime and it would have been counterproductive for America. So did he realize that, in fact, the virtue and value of his attack might have been counterproductive?
I think there is a fair argument to be made that threatening an attack is often more effective than actually attacking. You may remember that when Israel conducted its short campaign against Iran for several days last year, that the Americans chimed in with one strike, seemed to have conducted a private deal with the Iranians. The Iranians would strike their base in Qatar, which they clearly knew in advance because they evacuated the base. It was then struck with minimum casualties or no casualties. And then both sides called off the campaign. So I think even then the Americans had realized that actually striking, which obliged Iran to retaliate, really was not the right way to go. And very, very quickly, we've seen a dress rehearsal, if you like. There was a one strike each deal under which the entire thing was dialed down. So I don't see the American threats this time around as really trying to achieve very much more than getting the Iranians to understand that if they don't want to be hit, they need to do something different. Without, at the same time, I think in the American side, a great deal of enthusiasm for the evident retaliation. There were also reports, all very unverified, even though I chair the Foreign Affairs Committee of our Parliament. I have no access to anything classified, so I speak on the basis of public information. I will say that there have been unverified reports that there were some back-channel communications between the Iranians and the Americans, perhaps through an intermediary like Oman or someone else. You never know.
Trump himself alluded to it.
And therefore, if there have been back-channel messages from Iran, that may have helped bring us to this point, which has diffused the crisis.
And yet,
I'm not expecting it to get worse. I'm expecting it to get better.
And yet, Trump's threat, or maybe I should use the word commitment, to use tariffs against people who do business with Iran remains on the table. That is still there.
Yeah, I mean, tariffs seem to be his sort of ready shot solution to everything. He wants to tariff countries that don't support him on Greenland next. So I don't know. At some point, if he starts tariffing the whole world, no one will want to be able to do trade with America. And I'm not quite sure at the end of the day that that's a very, very wise way to proceed. But I can't imagine that all of this, most American security officials have always understood that a certain level of Indian engagement with Iran is actually in America's interest for two reasons. Number one, because you can't allow Iran to completely collapse. But number two, because if India is not doing it, the Chinese will. I mean, we're not doing Shah Bahar, China will take over Shah Bahar. They've already offered. I mean, this kind of stuff the Americans are very aware of. And as long as they had a fairly coherent vision of the world in which a leg up for China was seen as to their disadvantage, they had a tremendous level of tolerance, if that's the word I want, for India's involvement with Iran. Clearly, a lot of these assumptions are now coming with asterisks attached. And I don't know where exactly America really stands now with China's influence spreading beyond where it already is, and how strongly America cares about where India should be about some of these things.
Let's then at this point come to Greenland. Trump has said that anything less than Greenland in the hands of the United States is unacceptable. He's also said America will take Greenland one way or the other, either the easy way or the hard way. Do you really believe he's serious? Or is this just a lot of hot air at talk?
Look, there may be a certain level of posturing in order to concentrate minds on a better deal. There is, in fact, no need for America to take Greenland for security purposes, even if you accept Trump's proposition that Greenland is of vital national interest for American security, there is a 1951 Greenland Defense Agreement that allows the US not only to keep military bases in Greenland, but to establish new bases or entire defense areas if deemed necessary.
Except that Trump has gone on record to say that no one defends the lease, one only defends ownership, which is why he believes the 1951 defense agreement is not sufficient for his purposes. He's gone on record to say that.
Well, he better not say that too often, because all his bases across Europe and the NATO countries will essentially then be worthless. Because if you're not going to defend bases you don't actually own, on what basis is Europe staying in NATO?
But that's his position.
Well, that's a statement. What his position is and what the US policy is, I think we'll have to take a simply broader view. But I just want to add to what I was saying, Karan, that in any case, security is not, I think, the full story of Mr. Trump's interest in Greenland. There are now reports of both significant quantities of rare earth minerals buried under the ice and significant quantities of oil as well in Greenland, both of which I think is what perhaps is a bigger motivation for Mr. Trump.
But then is he determined to take it? But what about my question? Is he determined to take it, or is this bluster?
Listen to me. So there's also a third factor, which is the increasing phenomenon of global warming and the likelihood of melting ice north of Greenland, which is going to give Russia and China a much easier passage in that direction. So in a sense, you could credit Mr. Trump for thinking very long term. Seward, when he took Alaska in the 1850s, it was called Seward's Folly. Seward was the Secretary of State at that time. He also wanted to take Greenland. And the people at that time in American decision-making, including in the Treasury, were extremely unhappy about Alaska and completely dismissive of Greenland.
But you're not answering my question, Shashi.
I'm coming. You told me that I would be asked to answer with context. I'm telling you, you said that before that we came on the air. So I'm telling you, so this is the context. Greenland has been seen for over a century as of some strategic value to America. But there are now two new elements. Just as Seward didn't know about Alaskan oil when he took Alaska, the fact is no one knew about Greenland oil when Greenland signed the security treaty. So Trump will either want some very major concessions permitting American exploration of rare earths and oil in Greenland with some secure concessions where he won't have to compete with others, or he will actually want to annex Greenland for economic reasons and to be able to control and perhaps one day choke off future Russian-Chinese explorations in those waters. Now,
so you're saying to me that he's determined to take it. Is that what you're saying?
He seems determined to push this forward to the breaking point. But, when you say determined to take it, is it going to be at the cost of war with NATO? Is it going to be a cost of breaking up NATO? Is it going to be the cost of war with Europe? I don't believe so yet.
In which case he can't get it, because there's no way that the Danish government will sell Greenland. The government would fall if it did so. So the only way he can take it is forcibly, and that would shatter NATO. It would shatter the Atlantic alliance between America and Europe. And that's my next question. Do you believe he's prepared to pay the price?
It's more complicated than that. Denmark obviously has a certain sense of pride and unwillingness to surrender or sell the territory. But there is, in fact, a simple mechanism already provided for in Denmark and in Greenland, which is that there is a provision for a referendum at any time for the 40,000 odd voters out of the 57,000 population of Greenland to actually vote on their own future. They have every right to vote for independence, vote for complete merger.
The Prime Minister of Greenland has already gone on record, standing in the company of the Prime Minister of Denmark, that the Greenlanders would prefer to be with Denmark rather than with America.
I've heard you, Karan. But on the other hand, we haven't had somebody on behalf of Mr. Trump announcing to the people of Greenland that if, for example, they voted for merger with the United States, every one of them would get $1 million in their bank account. It would certainly be cheaper than going to war, because there are only so few of them, but that could swing the referendum to Mr. Trump. I mean, there are legal ways of doing this. Secondly, you say the Danish government would fall. I have received messages from Danish friends saying Greenland is a major drain on taxpayer money, and many people are saying we would love to have the blessed thing taken off our hands so that somebody else can do all the investing in Greenland.
Let me put this to
That
you.
may be a point of view, but
No,
I'm just saying, don't axiomatically assume that there is unanimity of views on all of this in either
Let me
direction
put this to
or
you.
anywhere else.
If NATO, as a result of Trump's ambition to acquire Greenland, actually shatters and collapses, the Financial Times has reported that many American bases in Europe could be in danger, and many European countries like Germany and Poland, and even Canada in North America, could consider going nuclear. If that happens, won't the world become much more volatile, fragile, and indeed much more dangerous?
First of all, I would imagine that the prospect of the collapse of NATO and the 2 centuries-old alliance with Europe will certainly concentrate minds on other solutions, such as a simple cash incentive to the Greenland voters, rather than anything that would involve the collapse of NATO.
There are Greenlanders who've gone on record that even if they're paid $1 million, they're not prepared to be sold. They've said so.
It wouldn't be sold then. It would be a referendum voting for a particular outcome, which is legally permitted.
You seem to be convinced that the Greenlanders can be bribed into voting for America.
I'm not convinced. I said there is no monolithic view anywhere. There will be some Greenlanders, we don't know how many, who would be very happy to have an incentive. There'd be some Danes, I don't know how many, who would be happy to see Greenland go. But there will be perhaps a majority of Danes who want to keep Greenland, and there may be a majority of Greenlanders who want to stay with Denmark. We don't know, Karan. All I'm saying is there are other means. Please, I do choose my words carefully. You seem to imply the only way Trump could fulfill his objective was through invasion and the collapse of NATO. I'm saying there are other means. Whether those means will be attempted and whether they will work, I don't know. But I'm just trying to nuance and make more complex what is not just a black and white issue. I also want to stress, that as far as this entire situation of bases in Europe is concerned, if NATO does collapse, then the bases are irrelevant. And if NATO does collapse, that will be an affirmation of a totally different worldview on the part of the Trump administration, in which Trump sticks to what is being dubbed the Don Roe doctrine, stays in the Western Hemisphere, and perhaps cedes other regions of the world to other powers. That would be the only logical underpinning for actually allowing NATO to collapse, withdrawing American bases and so on.
And he's very close to that, because the Dunroe Doctrine talks about setting aside the Western Hemisphere primarily for American influence and American interest. And the implication, I underline that word implication, is that he might be prepared to concede similar spheres of interest to the Russians and the Chinese. And if that is true, it would be particularly worrying for us in India.
Well, look, I mean, obviously that train has not left the station yet. There is talk of this, but don't forget when the former American administrations had the Monroe Doctrine, in which they asserted primacy over the Western Hemisphere, even then they also had ambitions around the world, in Europe, in East Asia, and everywhere else. So it's not that the two are incompatible. You can have a Monroe Doctrine and be interested in the rest of the world. But you're right that some of the rhetoric and the tweeting that accompanied the Busan summit with Xi Jinping first raised the question of whether there might be some willingness in Washington to contemplate a condominium arrangement between the Americans and the Chinese. And if now Europe is also going to be breaking up, then I think the Russians may also be beneficiaries of dominance over some more parts of Europe than they already dominate. So it's a very serious rethink of the world. One straw in the wind will actually come from India, because Mr. Trump's visit for the Quad summit has already been delayed. India's turn to host the summit should have occurred in November of last year, which would have been a year after Joe Biden hosted the Delaware summit of the Quad. Now I think we have to look very seriously at when Mr. Trump may come.
Sergio Gore has gone on record to say that sometime in the next 1 or 2 years, which suggests that Quad is not having an early summit at all.
I have commented publicly on that, saying that's an avoidable dampener on this line of thought. If Mr. Trump and the US are at all serious about the Quad, it cannot be a year or two.
But let's move away from Quad, because we're not talking about Quad.
No, I'm just saying, if, on the other hand, Mr. Gore is right, and Trump isn't going to bother to come for a couple of years. That means Quad is no longer important to the US. That means they are indeed backing away from a strategy of containment of China in the Indo-Pacific, in which case a number of other implications happen. It means that the US is no longer interested in this part of the world to that degree. Number two, that they will not defend this part of the world, which may mean they will not defend Taiwan either. And number three, India will have to rethink its own posture in its own region. So all of these things.
Absolutely. And it also means that if China were to take action on the LAC, we cannot expect or rely upon American support to us. That is another implication.
No, but look, America never pledged support to us, really. They've been giving us intelligence support and that sort of thing.
But that might be lacking this time round. That could be missing this time round if it were to happen.
Well, intelligence support, to the extent they still maintain intelligence assets, I'm sure they would want to share with us. Because, I mean...
How do you know? How do you know? You say you're sure. How do you know?
I don't know. It's my judgment. I thought that's all you're asking me for today was my judgment.
But you said you're sure. I'm asking you, how are you sure?
I didn't say I'm sure. I said I think they may want to share with us.
No, you did use the word sure, but you may have meant may. But you used the word sure. Let's come to Venezuela. President Trump has told the New York Times that America will be running Venezuela for years. The US Department of Energy has said it will control Venezuela's oil indefinitely. Is this beginning to look like modern-day colonialism?
It certainly sounds like it. In fact, I mean, it's precisely the kind of talk about Yankee imperialism we used to hear growing up in the 60s and 70s, now sort of writ large, apparently, in one particular Central American country. But I think the feasibility of all this still remains to be proven. The arrangement that Mr. Trump seems to have made is to decapitate the Venezuelan government, but retain the entire regime unchanged, including the security apparatus, the foreign policy apparatus, and the leadership in the form of the interim president. But we don't know if there is a long game. For example, would there be, for example, elections, in free and fair elections in which the recent Nobel laureate Machado...
But he hasn't talked about it.
He hasn't talked about it. As I said, we don't know yet what the long game is. In the short term, it certainly looks like an exercise in simply knocking off one inconvenient individual, but continuing to cooperate with the regime for the benefit now of US oil companies. The curious thing is many of the oil companies aren't terribly keen on this because they believe it will take an enormous amount of investment to extract the oil from an increasingly decrepit Venezuelan oil infrastructure. And for them, doing that without any really long-term assurances that they won't put all this money in and have it nationalized again by a future government is something that some companies are understandably skittish about.
Let me go back to a point you made a moment ago when you were talking about how the head of the regime has been cut off, but the main body of the regime remains in power. The truth is, Delcy Rodriguez, the interim president, was vice president under Nicolas Maduro. Her brother Jorge is president of the National Assembly. The powerful home and defense ministers continue in office. There are no American boots on the ground, whilst Venezuela's colectivos remain intact and operative. Trump clearly believes that he can rule Venezuela by remote control. Do you think the visit by the American CIA head, which is happening as you and I are talking, can actually convince the Venezuelans to play ball?
Look, I mean, I think that the Venezuelans have concluded very rapidly that given what America could do so decisively to their president, he could do to anybody, the Americans could do to anybody else in Venezuela, and they would much rather cooperate. Remember that essentially, so far, all they're surrendering to the Americans is control of the oil wells and the oil industry. When Mr. Trump announced that America would run Venezuela and so on, I think he meant more than that, but that isn't happening. The entire running of Venezuela is still in the same hands. Therefore, the usual ritual talk of democracy and freedoms and human rights has been noticeably absent in American rhetoric around the Venezuelan change. And therefore, Machado and her supporters are still quite disappointed. I think what we saw, this extraordinary act of theater in the White House earlier this week with the Nobel Peace Prize medal being passed from Machado to Trump like a baton in a relay race of dubious optics. That is part of a transactional attempt on the part of the Venezuelan opposition to try and get a foot in the door and try and get an opportunity, if nothing else, out of gratitude by Mr. Trump, to be able to, for example, have an election which they might have a chance of winning. But till all of that fructifies, all you've got is exactly the same system running in Venezuela, with the only differences being the oil will now benefit different people, and the Americans in particular.
In fact, the truth of the matter is that not only is he uninterested in finding a credible role for Maria Corina Machado, he's gone out of his way to say that she doesn't have support and respect from the Venezuelan people, which clearly is not true. And he's not saying anything about holding elections. That is the real lacuna in his Venezuelan position.
He said
he doesn't have any day after in mind.
So far, absolutely none. That's what I said. I said we don't know if there's a long game. And I think if there is a long game, it would have to be that within a span of time that both sides could agree on, and obviously within the lifetime of the Trump administration, there might be some call for elections. But it is striking. There's been no ritual genuflection towards the kind of democratic rhetoric that has usually accompanied American takeovers and stage-managed regime changes and even coups. The Americans have usually always talked about democracy and human rights. This language has been strikingly absent in this particular occasion.
Let's broaden our discussion before we end it. Iran, Venezuela, and Greenland are, of course, the most recent incidents of Trump's high-handed behavior. In the last few weeks, he's also carried out airstrikes over Syria and Nigeria. He's earlier cast covetous eyes on Panama. He's spoken of annexing Canada, and he's more recently threatened Colombia, Cuba, and Mexico. Is America becoming a rogue superpower under Donald Trump?
Well, we've never had that phenomenon, so I'm not quite sure what that term would mean. I will say that the conventional underpinnings of global order, the so-called rules-based liberal international order that Americans and Europeans have been touting for the last 75 years, certainly appears to be in disarray. I wrote a book a few years ago with Samir Saran called The New World Disorder, and certainly a reality far more so than when we wrote that in 2020. The world is a disorderly place now. There's a tremendous amount of unpredictability emanating from the denizens of the White House. And in these circumstances, it becomes quite difficult for anyone to say with any predictability what rules apply, other than apparently for the moment that might is right. Now, that's not quite the way the world was supposed to work, but certainly a lot of what Mr. Trump has done in his 11 months in office are not the ways in which anyone has ever seen an American president at work. So we just seem to need to adjust ourselves to a new reality in the White House.
Is that what you believe is Trump's justification? Might is right. I'm powerful. I'm the most important politician in the world. I will get my way.
I think it's an unspoken justification, but it's the only way we can describe the sum total of all his statements, posturing, and indeed actions in the last 11 months.
So might is right is Trump's justification.
Trump's justification, again, he's never sought to justify himself. If he feels mighty enough, he doesn't feel he needs to justify himself.
Precisely, yes. When might is right, you don't need to justify it. But that is the explanation. Might is right.
I would say that's pretty much what we're seeing out of Washington for now. Absolutely. The question is, how will Washington react when others follow the same precept? Because nobody else has done so far. See, China has tried to position itself as the reasonable, rules-upholding, multilateralism-loving, responsible player on the global stage. There was a speech by Xi Jinping to that effect, and he echoed it in the General Assembly in September last year. This is the sort of message that China is giving. But they could give the opposite message. They could say the heck with being the responsible, rules-abiding, world order upholding power. We're just going to march in and take Taiwan. It belongs to us anyway. And, Trump has proven that might is right. How will America react then? Difficult to say, but I think if they're going to be consistent, which is not a term we very often apply to the White House these days, but if they're going to be consistent, they'll have to step back and let China do exactly what they've done to us.
And a lot of people are convinced that, in fact, Trump wouldn't bat an eyelid if China were to march in and take Taiwan. Trump's interest and Trump's commitment to Taiwan is very different to that of people like Biden or even Obama.
Right, and Biden maintained a careful ambiguity that Mr. Trump has shared with his comment last week that it's up to Xi Jinping when somebody asks him about Taiwan. So if it's up to Xi Jinping, then the result is presumably a foreordained conclusion. It's just a question of when Xi Jinping feels he has the resources he needs to take it with the minimum cost to China.
Let me end by focusing briefly on Trump's seeming obsession with tariffs. He's already committed himself to a tariff on all countries that do business with Iran, even though he's now backing away from military action himself. He's now talking of a tariff on people who don't accept that America has a legitimate claim to Greenland. That's completely novel. How that will apply, no one can even begin to understand. And then there is Lindsey Graham's Russian sanctions bill, which apparently Trump has green-lighted, which will impose tariffs up to 500% on countries like Brazil, China, and India for importing Russian oil. Tariff seems to be the means and the mechanism he uses each and every time.
It's his default go-to option, as I mentioned earlier, when we talked about the Greenland tariffs threat. I mean, the fact is, it really is the most unusual way of proceeding. It doesn't make sense beyond a certain point. First of all, because obviously anyone with 500% tariffs will stop exporting to America because nobody will be importing their goods. Similarly, American customers who are used to certain items from those countries may start rebelling at the polling booth. I don't think it makes much sense. I mean, America is the world's greatest trading nation and has been for the last 75 years. But to be able to trade and to keep your market attractive, you actually got to be viable. I mean, the whole business of trade rests on the idea that both sides benefit, the purchaser and the seller, the importer and the exporter. So if you just keep raising the stakes through tariffs at every sort of drop of a political objection, then you're going to end up in a situation where no one's going to want to trade with you. I can't imagine Mr. Trump really wants to do that. But I think, we'll have to see. I mean, if he really starts tariffing people who don't support him on Greenland, then every European export to America becomes, again, unaffordable. And Americans don't produce everything that they consume. If there's 500% in Chinese goods, half the American supermarkets will be unaffordable.
But will he actually impose 500% on Chinese goods? The Lindsey Graham bill gives him the power to do so. It's quite possible that he will use that power to threaten Brazil and India. But will he actually threaten China? When he last time attempted it, with Green Earth, China hit back so hard, he backed off. Will he try it again?
China has leverage that we don't have. That's very, very true. And I've written that in one of my columns, pointing out precisely that what we need to do is rapidly acquire some leverage to be of any impact in this kind of transactional world. But the fact is, this kind of situation also will cause consequences within the US, I believe. And don't forget that in November of this year, Mr. Trump faces what's called the midterm polls, where there will be an opportunity for American voters to react to how they feel living under his administration, his rhetoric, and his policy choices. So, as they say in America, stay tuned.
Except that it's not worrying Trump at all. It's not worrying Trump at all, the prospect that the midterm elections loom in November. He's not concerned about it at the moment. It's not reflecting in the way he's behaving or talking.
You're quite right. For the next 10 months, he doesn't seem bothered. But I think if the Republican Party and the MAGA movement take a big hit at the ballot boxes in November, then I think there will be a huge reckoning to follow. So he's also got to think about all of that. He will constantly be made by his party to think about the effect on voters of some of the decisions he makes. Look, one thing that he's done by taking Venezuelan oil, if he can bring more of it back, would be to keep oil prices globally down, even if he continues punitive sanctions on Russia. The worry was that if Russian oil was so completely sanctioned that no one bought it, not even India, then the result would be that there would be greater demand for a finite quantity of oil, as long as Venezuelan and Iranian oil was still sanctioned as well. If Venezuelan oil is no longer sanctioned, it might compensate to some degree for the absence of Russian oil from the market and thereby keep oil prices more or less stable. I think that kind of calculation has been made in Washington, so that the American voter will not be paying more at the pump for his gasoline, as he calls it. And that is a very, very important vote getter and vote loser. Now, the question of supermarket items and foods and goods, you saw that Mr. Trump dramatically slashed tariffs on 31 popular items of food consumption. So he is sensitive to the impact of his decisions on his own voters. To say he does not completely bothered, he's not bothered at all by it is not totally accurate. But the truth is that if he keeps on threatening these things and doesn't follow through, the threats will lack credibility. So if he does threaten, does act on those threats, they will have political consequences at home.
So might will continue to be right until the Republican Party starts to rebel.
That was one way of summarizing it.
Shashi Tharoor, thank you very much for the time you've given me. Take care. Stay safe.
All the best. Thank you, Karan.
Hi, I'm Karan Thapar. Over the last few years, I hope you've been watching my program, The Interview on the Wire. During that period, I've interviewed doctors, politicians, businessmen, scientists, authors, and even the occasional Nobel laureate. For me, it's been exciting. I hope it's been enjoyable for you. But these, as you know, are tough times, and if this program is going to remain bold, independent, and sometimes even defiant, then I think we need your support. At the end of the day, it's a truism, but editorial independence is best defended by the viewers. So if you would like this program to remain the way it is, forthright, outspoken, and interesting, then would you consider supporting us? All you have to do is to click on the description at the bottom. But more than anything else, I hope you will continue to watch the interview. Your viewership means an awful lot to me.